right, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Really excited to spend an hour with you talking about the art of productive disagreement. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've been obsessed with disagreements and sort of what makes them unproductive, what makes them productive, why they're so difficult for many years now. I'll tell you a bit of my background. So who's talking here, since most of you probably don't know me. But yeah, this will be a mix of some sort of theories and some practice, and I'd love to ask a few questions and get responses from people in the chat as we go, and feel free to just pipe in anytime. And thank you to Mike and team for putting this together. I've been watching the talks and stuff, and it's all just been so great. I've learned a lot and taken a lot of notes already so far. So excited to be both a participant and a speaker here. All right, so the art of productive disagreement. Let me try to figure out how these slides work here. Why do I want to talk about this? Who am I to even, who are the experts on this topic that should be here? The funny thing about disagreements is that nobody is an expert in the sense of nobody has a PhD in disagreements. There's lots of things in sort of rhetoric and dialogue and persuasion and tactics and negotiation, all these things, but nothing that's about the thing that we always sort of strive for in these conversations, which is both people to come out feeling stronger, more informed, more connected, and more prepared to handle the problems that they're facing. So my path and career has been sort of wandering, as you can see. I was an undergraduate with a creative writing degree, sort of bounced around, ended up working at Amazon. It was down the street in '98 for a few years, and started a couple companies, actually started a restaurant and a bar and art gallery along the way, worked at Twitter, worked at Slack. I have a couple startups like 750 Words you might be aware of. And I also did a cognitive bias cheat sheet about 4 years ago that gained a lot of popularity and led to this book that I eventually wrote. And it really was about trying to synthesize all 200 plus cognitive biases into something that was easier to understand, because I found it really tough to really figure out why are these names so weird? What do they actually mean? I wanted to figure out how do I internalize this? And I ended up coming up with a framework for understanding why we have biases and where they all come from. And it really comes from a few very simple problems in the universe, like there's too much information, it's hard to make meaning of things, we don't have enough time to really decide everything we need to decide. And we have to actually act before we have all the information. And these things have become reasons why our brains develop biases to help us through these problems. And this led me to, thinking about what is another way of looking at this? Why is this practical? Why is this useful? And in my job as a product leader and entrepreneur, I always found that biases come out the worst in disagreements, right? The biases they flare up, I suppose, when we are highly motivated to win an argument, because this is why we filter out all the bad information that would disconfirm our theories. This is why we tend to only pick out information that supports us, or only like people that have been nice to us in the past. And so disagreement became the central focus of my thinking about this. And it's been just an amazing sort of rabbit hole to go down and to think about disagreements as opportunities instead of as these really annoying potholes that you run into throughout the day. So that's sort of my path. And right now I'm holed up in my house like many of you, and thinking about what's next. I'm not really sure what's next. Oh yeah, slides. So what we're going to talk about really briefly is what are disagreements, why do we have them, and how can we get better at them? That's the most important part of this entire thing. Is of course we can talk about the theory, but the real value here is in what can I do today? What can you do today to have more productive ones and get better at them over time? So I've broken it down into, rather than trying to dive into all the topics, 3 sort of juicy bits from the book, and 3 points that I think have resonated with people the most as I talk about this. So one of them is cognitive dissonance, which is that feeling when the way you see the world and the way that it appears that somebody else sees the world are in conflict. That feeling of anxiety, it's an acquired taste. And I think of it as not only just something to avoid, but something to learn to savor, learn to sort of appreciate in the same way that you would appreciate, a weird cheese or a wine or, anything that doesn't taste very good at first. This is really the key to the whole shebang, is to think of cognitive dissonance as the doorway to something positive rather than something negative. And then the other two topics I'll follow up on with are, changing goodwill in a room, like changing the way that people feel in the room is way more important than changing minds, and way more effective at actually changing those minds. And the third thing being disagreements are an infinite game. So this is a term that's been sort of popularized, and the idea of an infinite game is a game that you play to keep playing rather than a game that you play to win. And you can think of disagreements as one of the ultimate infinite games, where we want to continue to survive and thrive as people, and that requires us to have these relationships with them and to continue having the ability to bring up problems and solving them. All right, so let's just jump into it. Something to think about. So there's this thing called the water test, which I like to ask in the beginning, which is, imagine that you're waking up, it's been a long night out and you're parched, you're thirsty, you're a little hungover, whatever it happens to be, you didn't sleep well. And you just want a glass of water so badly, and you look over at your bedside table and there's a glass of water there, but you're pretty sure it's been there for a week or maybe more. It's been out for a while. Would you drink it? And that's one of the questions I like to ask, because oftentimes in a room, feel free to answer in the chat too. Would you drink a glass of water that's been out for a few days? And sort of, how do you make that decision? A lot of people have very strong negative or positive reactions to this, because it's not polarized, it's not a political question at all, but it sort of reveals that we have this internal source of intuitions that are informing us all the time about what we should do. And it depends. Yes, so that's a good answer. And so a lot of people will say, like, oh, absolutely not. And when I ask people why not, they'll be like, oh yeah, there's all kinds of germs, I'm gonna get sick, and then people are saying, like, well, absolutely I would, because I know that there's nothing wrong with this water, that it's gonna be totally fine, that there's the same bacteria in water as on fruit, and I can eat that. And you really frame it in these very personal but sort of subconscious sort of terms to yourself. And so what I liked about this was, we want to get used to this, to, like, when we think of a question, pay attention to how your subconscious is sort of bubbling up sort of anxieties or not anxieties. And because this is oftentimes the most important factor in how well the next steps of the disagreement are going to go. If someone's like, giving you a glass of water that's been out for a few days, and you're just like, oh no, you might also like project onto them, oh, why would they do this? Like, why are they so filthy? Why are they? Or vice versa. Like, if someone reacts to you negatively from this, you might wonder, like, why is that person so, like, such a germaphobe? But that it all springs from this initial feeling that we have. And a couple more examples. Let's see here. So the first picture being, people on an escalator. This is very, very West Coast, maybe even a San Francisco thing. I don't know. I've asked this a few times, and a lot of people are like, that's totally fine. Some people are like, well, why is Ronald McDonald? Is that part of the question? No. So people just like crowding the down an escalator in a subway or somewhere crowded where you're in a hurry. This is infuriating to some people and totally not infuriating to others. And think about, like, why is it infuriating? Sometimes I think, well, there's a cultural norm that this person is ignoring, and they think they're special, or they're just ignorant of, like, what's going on, and slowing everyone down on accident. Or it could be like, well, they have a big piece of luggage, and it's totally fine. So, and the middle one is bagels. I saw this on Twitter a couple years ago now, and it was just a very innocent tweet about, does anyone live in St. Louis and think this is totally normal? Or does anyone live in New York and think that this is totally crazy? Because I've gotten very strong reactions to this. And on Twitter, it was quite a fun, I guess, meme for a while amongst my small bubble, where people were just like, I've called the cops, or what? How dare you? Just because it doesn't seem right. There's something wrong with this if you're used to seeing them the other way. Exactly. No, that's not how you slice a bagel. Yeah, but if you then you think about it, like, okay, well, that is a reaction that we have, like, and it's one we've never challenged before. And so sometimes cognitive dissonance comes up when the assumptions that we've never challenged before are challenged for the first time, because we think this person must be so removed from my demographic or my social network circle that the norms that I have that I've never questioned are alien to them, and maybe they've got all kinds of other sort of things that alienate them from me. And this maybe was an evolutionary advantage at one point, but at this point, when we have such cultural diversity, it's more of a hindrance. And the last one being a pretty simple one: someone just like taking up two spots in a parking lot. If you have things that are like your pet peeves, I would love to hear them. Things that you just see them and they just, like, your blood boils instantly, like road rage, or the toilet paper going the wrong way, or whatever it happens to be. There's so many different kinds that things that can spark that, and they're very personal. And sometimes we sort of we feel that they're sort of precious to us. They're part of our identity. They're part of, it's loud chewing. I had a coworker that would chew an apple next to my ear when he was like reviewing my code or pair programming, and it would be just like the most annoying thing. But dog licking, slow drivers in the fast lane. And then so ask yourself, like, what are the norms that are being challenged here? What are the values that are being challenged here? People being late for appointments. Yeah, I have that one too. And if I'm even 5 minutes late, I just, I hate myself because I just have this so deeply ingrained in myself to be punctual. But there's so many. So I want you to think of them and actually just hold on to them, because we're going to come back to them. We'll probably add a few more. And in fact, so one other thing we can do is sort of rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. So some of these are probably, in the 1 to 2 range, but you could probably think of others that are even more anxiety inducing, or maybe even almost anything that could happen to us, like the pandemic itself, that probably causes some level of anxiety, whether or not you're going to run out of money, whether or not you're going to be able to keep your job, whether or not, the world will ever like return to any sense of normalcy, whether or not you'll ever see your, parents or your relatives. All these things that can spark anxiety as you think about them throughout the day. And just think about them and then scale them, because it's not always the most serious ones that cause the most anxiety. Sometimes it's simple things, and sometimes the most serious things actually spring us into action. So it's really hard to just look at something and guess what another person's level of anxiety is about it without asking them. And internally, that's also true, where we won't know. But paying attention to it and sort of creating this feedback loop is really the only way we can start to understand that, because whenever something causes this dissonance, it means that there's some mismatch between our mental model of the world, our mental model of people, culture, society, the way things should be, and the way they are or they appear to be in the moment. So make a list of these and start thinking about, like, if you start to think of each of these cognitive dissonances as a signpost to something that's valuable, to a value that you have, to a preference that you have, to something that's important to you, it's really interesting to use that, because this is going to be key to how we turn them into productive disagreements in the next step. So let me get there. So yes, can you identify, sense, feel the value behind the anxiety separately from the threat? This is how you pivot a disagreement, because the value is most likely something that you cherish, right? It's something that you think of in positive terms, and the threat to it is what causes is in direct proportion a negative feeling, right? And so the key here is, we oftentimes say, find something in common with the other person, but we've never really learned the tricks or the tools to actually do that in the conversation. And this is one of those kinds of tricks where you can shift from that negative feeling of the threat to the positive feeling of the value, and use that to say, like, oh, well, I've never seen anyone slice their bagels that way, and I've never even questioned that anyone would do that. So tell me more, like, where did you come from? Where do you live? What happened? And use that as a launching point for a completely different conversation you can have on the same topic. You don't have to dismiss them. You actually embrace, the topic, and you find the thing that is actually going to connect you rather than a thing that's going to disconnect you. So it requires you to really, use use some internal self-reflection tools to identify what the value is, really sense and feel where it is. I really liked Doug's sort of session last, which really, like, just listening to it, like I could feel those feelings, and it's very physical. And using that to then pivot and bring your heart rate back into a normal range where you can talk about something you like rather than something that you feel threatened by. All right, so you can write these down or just keep them in mind, or share them in the chat, because we will come back to these. But we'll move on to the second thing to practice right now. This is such a crucial point, which we often mistake, and we often go into a conversation or disagreement thinking we're going to change their mind, right? This is the cliche that we always we know it's wrong, but we also just can't help ourselves. And because again, it's one of those things where we're told not to do it, but we're not told what to do instead. And the thing that I found most useful in terms of doing instead of trying to change their mind is what I call the penny test. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this sort of tray that appears in gas stations or convenience stores. It's really just like this very simple tray that's like, hey, take a penny, leave a penny. If you have a penny, put it in the tray. And if you need a penny, this helps you round off the amount you owe to the cashier. And it's a really, you're giving something when it's not really that valuable to you. Nobody likes to carry pennies in their pocket. And at the same time, if you need one, it's really valuable. But think about this in terms of any room you're in, any conversation, whether it's online, offline, or not. You could start to think of, when you enter that room, am I going to leave a penny or am I going to take a penny? Do I need something from this group, but I'm going to take it and run? Or do I have something to offer the group and I want to do that? And this is a shift that we can do in terms of moving from that, again, that defensive position of being threatened to a more like connective sort of position. I want to offer my perspective on this, or I want to offer some leeway or some slack or some patience or some listening in order to understand where this cognitive dissonance is coming from. So how do we do that? Here's some more specifics and we can practice this. The interesting thing about this idea of every room you go into has this like sort of goodwill level. Sometimes you could come into say it's a meeting at work or a Zoom call at this point, and you could just tell that the back channel is just on fire. Everyone's talking about the things that they hate that are going on, or they're really unhappy with what's being said or the plan, but they're not talking about it out loud. In a in a low goodwill environment, everyone speaks to protect themselves. Everyone speaks with all the caveats, with all the evidence, with all the, every single reference they can cite, every single, sometimes they'll resort to a louder voice or to a more dominating presence in some other way. Like they just use all the tools, all the biases, all the motivated reasoning they can to just protect themselves and to advance their cause a little bit. This is like the battle. Interesting thing about this is that that civil disagreements, people disagreeing, and everything we've said about like how to tactfully tiptoe around disagreements, it doesn't make you leave this sort of stance, right? It doesn't make you leave the stance of protection, self-protection. And then while you do that, it sort of creates this barrier between you and the group, and you sort of suck the air out of the room a little. And if everyone does that, everyone's feeling miserable by the end. Then there's, a little bit nicer, which is, just avoid topics, just skirt around them, use humor, distraction, just end the meeting. These things that are about sort of tactfully weaving in and out of these things where you're not necessarily protecting yourself, but you're not looking at the problems either. And then, the one where you're actually leaving something in the room, offering yourself in some positive way, is to speak to reveal yourself in some way, or to see someone else as they really are, rather than, only their defensive behavior or only their offensive behavior, and actually see the person behind that, which we'll go into. And if you have any questions about that, we can have plenty of time to talk about that. I want to have an example here too. So I don't mean to pick on Neil deGrasse Tyson because, I think, he's a public figure. I figure that we can pick on him a little bit. He does this all the time, which, I both appreciate as a rational scientist, scientific thinker, where he's like, here are the facts, this terrible thing happened. Here are all the facts. And then he twists it and says like, hey, by the way, often our emotions respond more to spectacle than to data. And it's basically taking a dig at our feelings and saying like, well, this terrible thing happened, but it's not as terrible as the other things. And we saw this happening a lot. I mean, it happens all the time. And it's technically correct. It's technically a true statement. And so I think it passes the filter that many of us have in these conversations where we say something that's true, and the fact that it hurts people is their fault, right? And this is a way of taking pennies, without being accountable for it. And you can use this, you can find these examples everywhere that you look. And if you can think of a topic, or actually, let me go to the next slide, or we'll get to it soon. So again, reframing this, I'm going to talk about what is true and what is meaningful as like sort of this pathway towards productive disagreement. When we get stuck in this world of thinking, here are the facts, their facts are facts, take it or leave it, but at your own peril. It doesn't matter if they hurt your feelings. That's one way to operate, but it's sort of this neutral way. And as we get more into the positive ways to participate in a conversation, we can always trace back like, okay, well, why was this contribution? Why was that fact important to the conversation? What is the value behind it? What is the, like, am I, or is Neil deGrasse Tyson, or are you trying to connect? Are you trying to learn something? Is there a question in it? Is it curious? Why is it important? If we can get there, then that's actually going to start moving it forward. So think about a disagreement you have about hard facts. And there are so many, right? I mean, almost all of our policy disagreements, almost all of our work disagreements are like, can be reduced to facts, right? We can say like, this project failed and this person is at fault, or this person is bad on the team or should be fired because of these facts. Like, we have to document this stuff. Or it could be, this policy is bad, this leader is bad, this, whatever it happens to be. I'd love to hear examples, because I end up using the same examples over and over again. But I like to refresh that every once in a while. So what is a disagreement you've had recently that you believe is about hard facts? Like, where, you don't have to, when we could pick it apart, I'm not going to single you out and say like, well, it's not only about facts, but we can then tease it apart and say like, okay, well, what do I do with these hard facts? Do I just keep piling them on? Do I keep on, banging the other person with them until they relent or give up? What do we do? Because this is why we are so frustrated with so many conversations. Is we see these facts and we continually just like throw them back into the ring, hit the other person over the head with them, and we get really frustrated when that doesn't actually do anything. It actually just makes them madder and makes them meaner, and then they retaliate, and then we feel hurt, and it goes back and forth like this and escalates. Let's see these. Let me just like check the queue a little bit. Mike, if you see any questions that pop out that are worth that I missed, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. So think about that, and here are how we pivot. So instead of just saying what are the facts, which is a realm of the head, which is information, evidence, what is true? Oh, sorry. We can ask like, why are these facts important to this conversation right now? Why are these facts important to me? Why is it more important that I view, in this case, like death rates as more important than the feelings and the people behind them, and that we only care about the things that are causing the most harm? Okay, let me see. We're just trying to get some. What do you do each and every day is more important than what the president does? Oh, wait. That's yeah. I think that one is a good twist on it, right? That's already sort of getting ahead of me here. And then I'll come back to these. I think I'm having trouble keeping track. So what are the meaningful facts? Why are the facts meaningful? What does the other person know why they're meaningful to me? Is there anything I can share about myself that would give them context about why I have these feelings and why it's important for me to fight for this cause, whatever it happens to be? How can we leave pennies instead of taking them out of the conversation? Like, how can we shift from just being diligent, soldiers in the conversation to actually contributing to the goodwill of the room? And how can we shift the conversation to be more about, things we can learn from that person about their heart, what are their values, their preferences, rather than and what can they learn about ourselves? These are all questions that you can use to pivot a conversation from the hard facts to the what is meaningful group. And that means a flat earther. Ooh, interesting. Yes, this is a good one. I could talk for hours about flat Earth, because they do care about the facts. They just, this is such a good example of one where the facts aren't very reliable, and the heart of the matter is really about like, how much do I trust the government's information? How much do I trust NASA's information? How much do I trust my own eyes? And if you can start to think about like each of these things causes a different level of cognitive dissonance in different people. If, taking information from the government causes more dissonance for you than sort of looking at science and sort of understanding their perspective, then you could very easily swoop into a different position, because you start to avoid the things that you don't like to think about, and you start to veer towards the things that you do like to think about. And this is how we end up in very strange positions. Yeah, facts don't care about your feelings. Yes, this is a saying that is said in many different venues. I don't agree with it, but I also I like using it as a cornerstone or a centerpiece here, because it is one that we can obviously see both sides of. There are many things where feelings do matter a lot, right? And it's not either or. Okay, so those are the questions. And the last thing I want to sort of bring about before I sort of go into questions here is that disagreements are infinite games. The last thing on this sort of stack that I'm building here is like things to really leave more pennies than you take, is to shift from what is meaningful to what is useful, because ultimately this is what gets you out of that room, out of that conversation, and actually doing something instead of just endlessly sort of spiraling around the same topics. And because then you can learn something, you can do something together, and learn from it over time. And then this is the infinite game part of it, which is that if you want to think about conversations and disagreements as things that you play, things that you do in order to keep doing things, like you want to keep on having this this group together working on this project, or you want to keep on having this team or this family working together. You want the next time you meet up to be a little bit better than this one. This is why you're having these things, is to connect with the people, to like keep on playing. If there was ever a point where a disagreement could end, which is rarer than you would think, then you would end up sort of being sad. I've done this a couple of times where I've taken a disagreement that I have with a friend, and I'm like, just sit down for hours and resolve it, and when we do, and we end up just like seeing each other's sort of perspectives, and then sort of losing the desire to argue about it anymore. It's sort of a bummer, because oftentimes these heated topics between people are also the glue that keeps people together. It's part of what the relationship is about. And what else are you going to do? Those are strange relationships, perhaps, but they might be more common than you think. And I use this framework in the book, which is just like the head, the heart, and the hands. And the goal is to move, across towards the arrow, because you can't spend all day just talking about why you disagree. You have to ultimately move forward. And that's about taking something that's meaningful, taking all the information you have about it and doing something with it together. Yes. Okay, so here's an example that we can use here. I'm not sure if you've seen this one on Twitter. I take a lot of my examples from Twitter arguments that happen. There were two people. One of them owned a house outright and just paid utilities. The other person had a really expensive apartment in the city, and their rent was going up 10%. So this is a real life situation. Then they were sort of dating for a while, and they're thinking, well, is it time to move in together? Oops, okay, sorry, I don't know if there's another slide. And this is a question that inevitably comes up, and person A here is like, well, I've been paying for, I paid off my mortgage. I've been living here. It is cheaper, and so I will give you a discount, but I still want to charge $1,500 a month for rent, just to sort of pay back the opportunity cost. I could rent it out to someone else, or this money was spent, and I think it's important that everyone contributes to the fund. And person B is like, well, you're just taking my money for like, do you actually want me to move in with you, or do you just want me to be your renter? And they can just disagree about this. And this is a touchy subject that a lot of people can see both sides. Some people say like, well, you should only split actual costs and split the $200, pay for the utilities and maybe property tax, but not just for the potential mortgage. And then the other person would be like, well, this is not about an equal, this relationship isn't about like leveling all the books. And does anyone have a preference for which side they would be on in this conversation? I was actually, my position switched on it at one point, because when I saw it at first, I was like, well, I'm definitely on person B's side, because I think that it's silly to charge more. And then I actually had a friend who went through this from the other perspective, and then I saw her position. I'm like, oh, wait, no, I'm switching to A. But the interesting thing about this is that there is no right answer. You can't say that A is right or B is right. You can have a strong preference about it. You could say like, I strongly feel compelled that the way that it should be done is to split the fixed costs and no more, or vice versa. Yeah. So a lot of side A. Anyone on side B that thinks that they should not have to pay $1,500 a month. It's less than they're paying now by half, but it's more than person A is paying. I think this was the one that went out on Twitter when I saw it. So the reason I bring this up is that there is no right answer here. The whole point is that they're in a relationship. This is a conversation. Nice. Sophia's on side B. The whole point of a relationship is to find ways to work through these problems, right? And to continue playing in the sense of staying together. And it's almost a test. Like, if a relationship runs into this disagreement and one of the sides or both of the sides is more concerned about being like sticking to their side than continuing to play, that's basically the end of the relationship, right? And there's so many conversations like this where it's really not a test of right and wrong. It's a test of, can this work out? Can you find a solution that works for you, both of you? If not, it's over. This also comes up in work a lot, where this cliched sort of triangle of quality, like you could build a high quality product, you can build the product fast, or you could build the product cheaply. And, there's that 2 out of 3 sort of quip about like, you can choose 2, which means that if you want it to be fast and cheap, the quality is going to be low. If you want to be high quality and fast, it's going to cost a whole lot, right? And again, there is no right answer. Like which one of these things is most important? It really depends on the situation, and if a culture sort of bubbles up where they value quality over the other two, over time, the cost of the neglect of speed, for example, might come back and bite them, and it can sort of cause debt to accrue that eventually makes speed the most important thing to focus on next. And so again, you can't really find the final answer. You have to continue to loop around and continue to make it work, which means sometimes switching positions as you go, as sort of the circumstances change. So again, a question for you. Think of your best friend, your partner, or someone that you like really work closely with, or someone that you get along, like really understand well. And I would love to hear if you have any like core disagreements that you just come back to again and again, and that just go on and on, that you could just argue about forever. Sometimes I've a couple, like the water test example came from friends of mine who had been married 10 years, and they just continuously argue about this water thing. Like the husband grew up, in Australia, sort of on a more like remote place, I guess, and was much more acclimated to germs and sort of dirt and these things. And the wife was more, sort of worried about germs and cleanliness, and in various ways you can see how this value difference can be expressed in that conversation, but it would be expressed in a whole bunch of others. As well over time. It could be about like, who sits on which spot of the couch, or art. what is not. Yeah, what is good art, what is bad art. Yeah, this is something that can grip a relationship, especially if it's about taste, right? If it's about, it could be about what art you like better. It could be about, whether or not sports is worth watching on television, whether or not romantic comedies are great movies, whether or not science fiction and fantasy is as a genre worth pursuing. Religion, yes, that's a classic one where, this is about the ultimate reality of the universe, and you can see how this isn't going to be resolved. But ultimately, each of these things is so interesting. I mean, I had the religious one too. Yeah, art. So you can see that these are about personal preferences in a lot of ways and personal choices, that, information is going to change their mind. No matter how much you sort of express yourself about how this is important. Like, you might say like, okay, I understand why religion is important to you or not important to you. But after a point, there's not much else to say about it, because you're not going to change their mind. They're not going to change your mind. What we can do is use that information to then say, okay, well, how can your belief and my belief in these things help us make better choices in the future, help us choose better spots to go on vacation, or help us choose better museums to go to, or help us, have more interesting, art in our house, whatever it happens to be. Because sometimes you can find that way to play with each other in disagreement that allows you to actually enjoy each other. And I'm curious if any of you are sort of adding these things to the chat, which is so interesting. If you're at a point where you appreciate the difference with them, where I asked you to think about your best friend, your best, sort of relationships. Like, how does that change your relationship to have these conversations? And if they went away, like, how would that make you feel? I say this because we have all experienced this, I think, on some level, where we have a core disagreement with someone, and we know they're wrong, and we know that we're right, but we love them despite that. And we sort of appreciate how they see the world differently than us. And we wouldn't necessarily want to change them, but sometimes on our good days and on bad days, of course, we do want them to change. So yes, let me see here, try to catch up here. Yeah. Yeah, values discussions. Yeah, so the interesting thing is almost everything is a values discussion, because if it wasn't valuable to you in some way, you wouldn't be having the conversation. If I said, oh my gosh, I'm reading this book and the character in it is such a jerk, I hate them so much, and you're like, you haven't read the book, you don't care about the book, you're just gonna be like, cool, that's fine. It's not important to you. You're not going to have that argument. It's only when you've also read the book and you have a different, value hit there, or a different take on it, that you're going to engage them. And so, regardless of how much it can be reduced to facts, there's always the reason why it's important to you to argue about this. And sometimes, and it makes us vulnerable to, as we go throughout our days, participating in things online with people that we know and some people we don't know. Every time you bump into one of these sort of dissonances, you have this opportunity to engage them in something. But obviously, you're never going to run out of that, right? There's never going to be a point where they're all figured out. And we can choose, though, whether or not to engage them, and we can also choose where we hang out and where we sort of tend to expose ourselves to these kinds of questions. Because if we don't want to engage them, then why are we going around like sort of just bumping into things that make us feel bad? And there's a lot of this, commentary around social media in general, and how do we not avoid, we don't want to avoid important things happening in society, but we also don't want to just emotionally exhaust ourselves and become sort of anxious and frustrated and ultimately, sort of upset with the world. So, all right. So, yeah, I have a couple arguments where, with my grandfather, for example, like he believed in a certain philosophy of life, which was like he grew up in the 30s and he was a hobo for a while, lived on trains, very poor, lived on a farm, has 13 brothers and sisters, and everything in his life is around like finding some way to like get advantage over the others. And so he was raised in this, and took me my whole life. It wasn't until like the year that he died that I had this conversation with him where I was like, tell me more about like where this sort of philosophy came from. And he told me all these really heartfelt stories of his earlier years, and I could hear them in a way that really enriched our conversation and our relationship. And I'm so glad to have been able to do that, because people aren't, when they're not around anymore, you start to wonder like, well, what could I have done to connect with them before they left? And so finding out that these disagreements are the doorway to building these relationships back up is so important. And I'm really having a hard time reading and talking at the same time. So feel free to, like, if anyone sees something scroll by that they want to pop back up or bump it back up, please feel free to do that. Or if I just missed it. Okay. So what do you think? So these are the 3 points that I'm sort of circling around. So cognitive dissonance is an acquired taste, because we can learn to see them as these opportunities, and you learn to understand where our anxieties are coming from, what values are being triggered. If you can think about a conversation as one where you may not change their mind, but you can actually offer something of yourself, reveal yourself in some way, add some goodwill to the room, we've all been in those situations where, there's a big problem, but everyone trusts each other to figure it out. And someone's like, I think we should do X. And you can say like, go for it. And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure it out. Versus like, well, where's the evidence that X is a good plan? Have you done all the diligence? It's when we say those kinds of things, it's not because we actually want that information. It's because we don't trust them. And trust is hard to earn. So focusing on how do you earn trust, how do you build trust, how do you build goodwill is the task that we have in a disagreement, way before anyone is going to change their mind about something. And then lastly, think about disagreements as things you have in order to keep having that relationship. And if you don't want that relationship, then that's the question you should be asking, not whether you shouldn't think about the content of the conversation. Just saying like, this is something I can either use to grow as a person, or maybe it's not worth it to me. Maybe I have enough of these kinds of relationships in my life. I don't need more. And then, we don't have an infinite capacity to address all disagreements in the world. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on any of these, if they are clear. If you disagree with it, I would love to hear that as well. Yeah, and I'll try to catch it. This is really tough for me. I can see some conversations within the chat room as well, so I don't want to assume they're all to me. Astrology. Okay, what's the astrology one? So my best friend dismisses my passion as junk science. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. This was the topic in my book too, because I've had very unproductive conversations about these things, and it's fun to try to find the hard ones to work with. And I found a way to have a conversation. One of the things was about spirituality, astrology, ghosts, ghost experiences, and just all those related kinds of bits. And I've always been traditionally, I was always pretty dismissive and on the side of maybe your friend, not, and it does come across as dismissive. But, then I was like, well, how can I turn this into a productive disagreement? I hosted a salon at my house where everyone came to talk about, in this case, ghost stories. And the whole point was not to, challenge each other's beliefs, but to just understand, like, when did they happen? Did you have any? How were they useful? Like, how did they help you interpret the world? And it was really interesting, because at first I was like, oh yeah, I don't believe them, but I was still thinking, like, why aren't they paying attention to science? But after a few days, it sunk into me that, at least as far as the people in the room, they were using ghosts as a language to talk about the unknown. And it's more about the belief that, and things like astrology fit into this too, is like, the universe is more complicated than any of us can like, that science can never reveal fully. So, oh, good. I got a question. I'll read this in a second. So how do we talk about the things we don't know in a way that leaves things open to us being wrong about how they are now? And when I started to think about, like, this idea that ghosts are a way to talk about the mysterious and the unknowable things in the universe, I really started to appreciate it, because it became a way to talk about something that's a lot richer, a lot more like colorful than the way that I have always thought about them, as like scientific probabilities and evidence and sort of proofs of and things. So I've since come around a little bit to understanding like why this language of sort of supernatural is important to people. Okay, so let me see this question really quick. I don't want to divert the conversation. Let's see. In the context of toxic relationships, if there is legitimate psychological and emotional abuse, but the abuser stonewalls their partner and refuses to acknowledge their grievances or concerns, so the core disagreement there is knowing that the problem and the dynamic ultimately is unsustainable, but they refuse to take accountability or acknowledge their neglectful nature. I agree with what you're saying. Let's see. Yes, this is a great question. Let me try to answer this. So in a toxic relationship, it's important to disentangle, like, what is true? Like, is there abuse happening? And if that's irrefutable, and then you can ask, like, what is meaningful? Like, why is this relationship meaningful to me? Why is it important that I stay in it? Why is it important that the other person changes their behavior? Why is it important? All these things, and what am I afraid of if I leave? Like, what will happen to me? What are my fears about it? And also, who can help me? Who can see my perspective? Who can I go to for help? I think that, and then the third thing being ultimately is, what do I need to do, right? And so the best way to think about, how can I make the right next action in this relationship? It might not be about trying to convince them that they need to stop. It might be about leaving, or it might be about finding a mediator, or it might be about recording things. And so sometimes in this case, the disagreement that might be, causing the fights or causing the abuse may be completely unrelated to the disagreement you have internally with yourself, or or that your friend has with themselves, in terms of, what do I need to do next? And that conversation might not have that person in it at all. And it might be about between you and your support system, might be between you and your, anything else that can help you. It might just be an internal, struggle in your own head that you need to decide. But shifting it from, is that person bad? Probably, yeah. But what are you going to do about it is the next question. And I think I see a lot of, when there's a fear of leaving, or there's or an ability, or like the capability isn't there, that could continue, like, sort of keep you in this conversation about, good and bad, about whether or not they are worthy of being your partner and that kind of thing. So think about how to get outside of that trap of only thinking about the facts, and think about the actions that you can take. I hope that was helpful. Oh yeah, astrology is going. And feel free to follow up if I missed something about that, Laura. And this is crucial. Like, the biggest follow-ups that I oftentimes have on these is that not every disagreement has to be entered, right? Obviously, there's so many of them. And we always have to think about, what is the most important decision, or the most important thing I can do next to reduce the likelihood of, harm, survival, continued abuse, that kind of thing. I love this back and forth with science going on here. Yes, so this is what I always get into. And so astrology isn't a science. Okay, what is it? It could be something else then, right? I think that there are interesting ways to let go of this particular debate, which is about, like, what are the facts? Does the other person dispute whether or not astrology is a science, or is it more about, why is it useful? Why is astrology useful to people? Is it about having something to free associate with in the beginning of a day to sort of kick you off in the right start? Or is it about something that's about a routine, or is it about something about the symbols and the imagery and the narrative of the whole thing, or is it about a community or that they belong to? All these other reasons that something can be valuable other than whether or not it's a science. Of course, yeah, hopefully I'm not just jumping in there. I don't know. I can't really read the whole thing. So does anyone have, so Laura, did that answer your question? And does anyone have other examples of disagreements that they are in that seem like stuck, where you feel like there's no way to move forward? Because this is sort of the challenge. Like the things that are hardest, the things that make us most frustrated are the ones that feel stuck, that feel like, oh, I'm not going to even engage in this anymore because there's no point of it. There's no way it can go forward. When there's always a way to move forward, we just have to ask the right question, which is, what am I doing wrong in this conversation that contributes to it being stuck? And also, are there any other strategies we could take in order to find some other doorway out of this conversation that can help us both learn from each other and both value each other and figure out how to move forward. Okay, question from Weaver of Dreams. Do you think that all people involved in a disagreement need to embrace the productive view so a solution can be found? It's a great question too. No, I don't think so. I think it's possible for one person needs to have enough energy. So this is a question of it shouldn't always fall to the same person because it can be extremely draining. But if there is a conversation, say that you are the only person that in a conversation that wants to have a productive one, it's going to take work. It's going to be emotionally draining. It's going to be personally draining. But you can use this energy to a good end, which is to move it forward. So when a conversation is stuck and the other person is like they've shut down or they just won't budge from their conversation, that's where the goodwill part comes in. Like where is the goodwill in this conversation right now? Is it at rock bottom or is it middling? Have there been moments? Are there moments in the relationship where it ebbs and flows? Try to think of ways to shift the goodwill up. So whether that is like, let's spend some time together that is not about this. Let's talk about other things. Let me do something for you. Let me tell you about something, and let me ask you questions about you that they don't have an agenda behind it. These kinds of things are all strategies you can take to build the goodwill back up. Sometimes it's about changing venues or taking a break or going on a walk, getting a drink. I mean, these are things maybe, pandemic friendly versions of these exist. And so I would let go of the desire to change their mind necessarily and to turn it into a productive disagreement in the moment. But if the relationship is important to you, think of ways to raise the goodwill, and that means revealing yourself to them in some way that hasn't been possible before because you were guarding yourself, or it can be about asking them questions. So that's how you can begin to get the goodwill back up. And once it is back up, then that could take a while, right? Depending on how long the relationship has been going on, how long it's been down, all these other things that need to be worked out. And sometimes, like, I read a lot of articles about people that can convert you from being part of the Ku Klux Klan if you are just friends with them for 5 years. And that's a very expensive way to change someone's mind. And I doubt that they would even say that they did it for that intention, but somehow by building that relationship first, it allowed perspectives to shift after 5 years. And we're dealing with parents, for example, it might take that long because they just the relationships are so, locked in after time. So hopefully that helps. Feel free to follow up with that if it's not clear. Cool. Some agreements are most productive if left early. Yes, I think that there's a terrible strategy we have, which is argue to exhaustion and try to get the other person to just give up. And that's not going to work. And even if they do give up, they're not going to change their mind. So don't think that you have to do it now. Think about the next time you talk? What can you do better next time? And think of the long term. And that's why I think about them as infinite games. It's not about doing it right now, always. Let's see. Okay, Johnny. Oh, hi, Johnny. In relationships, what might be some ways to proactively inquire into open loops or help give permission to bring up things that might be challenging or triggering to talk about, but better to talk about them sooner before they snowball? Yes, this is a good question. I think to proactively inquire. I mean, I think, in relationships that are in good terms, this is such a fun thing to do, right? Like, this is about digging in deeper into sort of how people see the world. And you really have to tap into that curiosity about them. And, in a good relationship, you have that, where you can say, like, okay, well, let's just do a deep dive on astrology or on politics or on religion or on, any of these big topics, the shape of the earth, if they're a flat earther. And just like, let's just walk through it and just like paint the picture for me and tell me about this, entire universe that you have in your head, and use that. That's going to be such an enriching conversation, regardless of whether or not you get to that specific point. You might end up in many different points that you can come back to later. So I think addressing them early is important, especially when you perceive them as challenging, because it means that sometimes if, as relationships progress, they can get locked in to, like, here are conversations we will never have, because if we would have had them, we would have had them in the past already. And then both people think this, and you're trapped out of there for a while. It takes more effort to do it. And so I would say knock on those doors early and ask really interesting questions. So I call it like questions that invite surprising answers. So questions that you ask them with no expectation about how they'll be answered. Because when you have expectations about how they'll be answered, you're starting to like prejudge their answer. So ask really open-ended ones, like, where did this belief form? Who do you admire that has this belief? What do people like me mistake or misinterpret about this perspective in the past from you? Things like that are really just about, use them as a mirror for your own blind spots about their perspective, and ask those questions. Shoot, there's so many questions here, and I think we're almost out of time, but let me scroll and see if there's any that directly mention my name. I hope I can go back and read these. And if anyone, I'll be in the chat. I think we can message each other maybe, but if not, I'm at Buster on Twitter. And I'm happy to follow up on these if you want at any time. So it's definitely one of my favorite topics. So thank you for showing up and sort of participating in this. And I hope it was valuable to you. I hope you can come away with this, with those three things: sort of see cognitive dissonance and reframe anxiety as an opportunity. Think about goodwill over changing minds, and play to keep playing. Practice it as if it were going to the gym, right? Practice disagreements as if this was a skill you could foster in yourself, and a skill that you can become stronger in, which sometimes means you go to the gym when you're like in really bad shape, right? And you start on with the easy weights, and you start with the easy sort of things, and you sort of build yourself up, because eventually, this is a skill. I call it a meta skill because it applies to every part of your life, and it can help all of your skills become better. So thank you so much. I think I can hand it back to Mike now whenever you're ready, and feel free to follow up. Buster@benson.fm is my email, @Buster on Twitter, and you could just Google me. I'm everywhere. So thanks again.